Elara Hayes believed her life was a closed book, and she was the only one with any interest in reading the final, quiet chapters. She was a widow, a word that felt both too large and too small for the space it occupied inside her. It was a fact, like the color of her eyes or the way her hair, once a rich brown, was now threaded with a gray that felt less like age and more like dust settling on a forgotten object. Her husband, John, had been gone for 4 years, a length of time that had done nothing to shrink the cavern. His absence had carved out of her world. It had only made the echoes inside it more profound, more a part of the house's natural silence. She had made a promise to that silence, a vow whispered into her pillow in the dark hollow of the first year after he was gone. She would not do it again. She would not build a life around another person, only to have the architecture of her own heart torn down. Love was a risk she had taken once, and the cost of its loss was a debt she would be paying for the rest of her days. She would not incur it a second time. She was not, by the town's standards, a woman who would invite a second look, and she was grateful for it. She was wide-hipped and heavy-shouldered, built for work, not for adornment. In the reflection of the general store window, she saw a woman who was sturdy, practical, and utterly invisible. Her hands were capable, her face plain, but not unkind. There was nothing about her that called out for attention, and she had cultivated that lack of magnetism as a gardener tends a wall of ivy, encouraging it to grow thick and impenetrable. Loneliness was its own kind of company, a tangible presence that sat with her at the dinner table and lay beside her in the too large bed. It was a heavy cloak, but it was also a familiar one, and she had learned its weight, adjusted her posture to carry it without stumbling. To be seen, truly seen, was a vulnerability she could no longer afford. It was safer to be a shadow in her own life, a quiet observer of the seasons turning outside her window, of the town moving on without her. That was why the decision to bake the pie was so strange. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, the sky the color of a tarnished silver spoon. A new neighbor had moved into the old Miller cabin down the road a few weeks prior, a man no one seemed to know much about. She had seen him once or twice from a distance, a solitary figure mending the sagging porch rail or clearing brush along the creek. He kept to himself, and the town, in its way, kept from him. But the silence from that cabin felt different from her own. Hers was a silence of memory and loss. His felt like a silence of intent, a deliberate wall. And the despair in her own house had been particularly thick that morning, clinging to the corners of the rooms like damp cobwebs. She needed to do something. She needed an act, a motion, a task that had a beginning and an end. So she told herself a lie. The lie was that she was just being neighborly. It was the proper thing to do, to welcome a newcomer. It meant nothing. That was the lie she needed, the one that gave her permission. It was a small, practical lie, like putting a patch on a worn dress. It wasn't beautiful, but it held things together. She went to the pantry and pulled out the flour, the sugar, the tin of lard. The movements were automatic, ingrained in her muscles from years of baking for John. Flour dusted her apron, a fine white powder that settled in the creases of her hands. She worked the lard into the flour with her fingertips until it resembled coarse meal, the scent clean and fatty. The small, repetitive action was a balm. It was real. It was something to hold on to in the vast, empty sea of the afternoon. She peeled the apples with a small, sharp paring knife, the blade moving in a steady, rhythmic spiral. Each crimson peel fell away to reveal the pale, vulnerable flesh beneath. She cored them and sliced them thin, the knife making a crisp, satisfying sound against the wooden board. She thought of nothing but the apples, the cinnamon, the precise amount of sugar. This was safe. This was controllable. A pie was a set of rules, a recipe that, if followed, would produce a predictable and comforting result. It was not like a heart, which could follow all the rules and still end up broken. She arranged the apple slices in the pastry-lined dish, overlapping them in a careful pattern no one but she would ever see. She dotted them with butter and sprinkled them with the cinnamon sugar mixture that smelled of warmth and holidays and a life she no longer lived. She laid the top crust over the fruit, crimping the edges with her thumb and forefinger, a motion as familiar as her own signature. When the pie was in the oven, filling the house with a scent so achingly nostalgic it almost brought her to her knees, she sat at her kitchen table and felt the lie settle into place. It was just a pie, an act of kindness for a stranger. It was not a gesture of hope. It was not a crack in the wall she had so carefully built around herself. She was not nervous. She was not hopeful. She was a woman baking a pie because the silence in her house had become too loud. That was the truth she held on to. The one that allowed her to pull the golden brown bubbling pie from the oven, let it cool on the rack, and wrap it in a clean tea towel. It was the truth that allowed her to walk out her front door and down the dirt road toward the Miller cabin. The warmth of the dish a solid, real thing against her hands. He answered the door on the third knock. He was taller than she had thought, with a frame that seemed to have been built for hard labor, but was currently held with a kind of weary stillness. His hair was dark and unruly, and his face was all angles and shadows, stubbled with a few days' growth of beard. He looked like a man who had traveled a long way and had not yet found a place to rest. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, quiet blue, and they were tired, but they were also careful. They looked at her not with the polite disinterest she was used to, but with a steady, unreadable appraisal. He was not looking at a widow, or a neighbor, or a sturdy plain woman. He seemed to be looking at her, and the sensation was so unfamiliar, it was like a physical touch. "I'm Elara Hayes," she said, her voice sounding unused, rusty. "I live just up the road. I saw you'd moved in. I brought you this." She held out the pie. His eyes moved from her face to the offering in her hands. A flicker of something, surprise maybe, passed through them. He took the pie, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was nothing, a stray spark, but it sent a jolt through her that was entirely unwelcome. "You didn't have to do that," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. "It's just neighborly," she replied, repeating the lie to him, hoping it would sound more convincing out loud. To go with the pie, she had written a small note. It was a habit from her life with John, leaving little notes tucked into his lunch pail or his coat pocket. It felt incomplete to give a gift without a small piece of herself attached, however insignificant. The note was simple, written on a scrap of paper in her neat, looping cursive. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I hope this brings a little warmth to your home. Elara Hayes." She had tucked it under the tea towel. He saw the edge of the paper and pulled it out. He unfolded it and read the few simple words. And then it happened. It was not a grand or dramatic shift, but it was unmistakable. A tightening around his eyes, a sudden, profound stillness in his posture. He looked from the handwriting on the note up to her face, and the careful appraisal was gone, replaced by an expression of such intense, guarded shock that it felt like he was seeing a ghost. The air between them grew thick and heavy. He stared at her plain face, and her sturdy frame, and then back at the looping, familiar curves of her handwriting. It was as if the two things, the woman standing before him and the script on the page, were impossible to reconcile. Two pieces of a puzzle that should never have fit together. He seemed to be holding his breath. She felt a prickle of unease. "Is something wrong?" He blinked, and the mask of weary neutrality slid back into place, but not before she had seen the raw astonishment beneath it. It was like watching a shutter open and close on a hidden room. "No," he said, his voice a little strained. "No, nothing's wrong, thank you, for the pie." He paused, and in that pause, she could feel him wrestling with something. He seemed to be warring with two different impulses, one that urged him to retreat and close the door, and another that pushed him forward. The second impulse won. "My name is William," he said finally, "William Thorne." He looked at her, then at the pie, then back at her. The expected social script was for him to thank her again, and for her to retreat back to her quiet house. He did not follow it. "I was just about to make coffee," he said, the words coming out slowly, as if he were testing their weight. Would you like to have a cup with me?" The invitation hung in the air between them, completely unexpected. It was a disruption of the natural order of her life, of the quiet, unobserved path she had laid for herself. Her first instinct was to say no. To thank him and flee back to the safety of her loneliness, where there were no surprises, no unreadable expressions, no jolts of unwelcome feeling. But she didn't. She thought of the oppressive silence of her own kitchen, of the long, empty afternoon stretching before her, and she thought of the look in his eyes when he read her note, a look of such profound, hidden meaning that a spark of curiosity, an emotion she hadn't felt in years, flickered to life within her. It was a small act of rebellion against the vow she had made to herself, a tiny crack in the wall. "Yes," she said, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "I would like that very much." His cabin was sparse, almost monastic. There was a simple wooden table with two chairs, a stone fireplace swept clean, and a narrow bed covered with a plain wool blanket. It was the home of a man who traveled light, who was either unconcerned with comfort or unaccustomed to it. He moved with a quiet efficiency, getting 2 mismatched mugs from a shelf, filling a kettle from a bucket of well water. Elara sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, feeling strangely out of place, and yet, at the same time, not entirely unwelcome. The silence that fell between them as he worked was not the awkward, grasping silence of strangers struggling for conversation. It was a comfortable quiet, a shared thing. It was the kind of silence she had once known with John, where words were unnecessary because the simple act of being in the same room was communication enough. This man, this stranger, seemed to speak the same silent language she did. He set a steaming mug in front of her. "I don't have any cream or sugar," he said, his tone apologetic. "Black is fine," she answered, and it was. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her skin. He sat opposite her, his own mug cradled in his large hands. He didn't look at her directly, but at the dark liquid in his cup. "This town," he said, not as a question, but as a statement to be considered. "It's a quiet place." "It can be," she agreed. "Most people have been here a long time. They know each other's stories." She didn't add that they were often wrong about those stories, that they saw only the surfaces and filled in the rest with their own assumptions. "And what's your story?" he asked, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. It was a direct question, the kind people in Northwood Creek rarely asked. They preferred to gather their information in whispers and sideways glances. The question should have made her retreat, but it didn't. Coming from him, it felt less like an intrusion, and more like a genuine inquiry. "I was married," she said simply. "My husband, John, passed away 4 years ago. This was his home, his family's home, so I stayed." He nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his tired blue eyes. He didn't offer the empty platitudes she had grown so accustomed to hearing. "I'm so sorry for your loss. He's in a better place." He just listened, accepting her words as fact, as the shape of her life. It was a profound relief. He seemed to recognize that her grief was not a performance requiring an audience, but a quiet, permanent part of her landscape, like a mountain or a river. And in that moment, she understood the nature of his silence. It wasn't born of aloofness or disdain, it was born of respect. He was a man who knew how to let things be. This quiet understanding, this shared comfort in the spaces between words, felt both new and strangely familiar. It reminded her, with a startling pang of recognition, of W. The thought came unbidden, a ghost slipping through a door she had left unlocked. For 2 years, W had been the sole recipient of her true thoughts, the one person in the world to whom she was not invisible. It had started with an advertisement she'd found tucked away in the back pages of a regional newspaper she'd been using to line a shelf. The notice was small, the print unassuming, seeking correspondence with a person of sincere thought. No names, no meetings, no expectations beyond the honest exchange of letters. A conversation of minds, sheltered from the judgments of the world. Please reply to P.O. Box 7. Attention, W. She had read it 3 times. It had been 2 years after John's death, a time when the initial, sharp agony of grief had dulled into a chronic, aching loneliness. Her days were a rotation of chores, her nights a battle with the silence. She spoke to the grocer, the postmaster, the occasional neighbor, but the conversations were thin, brittle things, concerned with weather and prices. No one asked what she thought about the color of the sky at dusk, or the weight of a memory, or the fear that she was slowly disappearing. The advertisement felt like a message in a bottle written specifically for her, a conversation of minds, sheltered from judgment. It was everything she craved and everything she feared. For a week, the newspaper clipping sat on her mantelpiece. It was a foolish idea, a schoolgirl's fancy. Writing to a complete stranger, a man no less, but the anonymity was the very thing that made it possible. We wouldn't see her sturdy frame or her plain face. He wouldn't know her as John Hayes' widow. He would only know her thoughts, the part of her that had been silent for so long. One evening, with a trembling hand, she had written her first letter. She didn't know what to say. She wrote about the sound of the wind in the pines outside her window, a sound that used to feel like a lullaby and now felt like a lament. She wrote about the feeling of being a ghost in her own home, her footsteps leaving no impression. She signed it simply, E. To her astonishment, a reply had come 2 weeks later. The handwriting was strong and clear, the words careful and deliberate. He wrote not of grand philosophies, but of small, tangible things. He wrote about the shame of past failures, a weight he carried that was as real as the pack on his back. He described loneliness not as an absence, but as a cold room he was forced to inhabit. He understood. In his words, she found a mirror to her own unspoken feelings. He had seen the truth in her letter, the the shape of her loneliness, and had offered his own in return. Their correspondence had become the central pillar of her emotional life. Twice a month, she would walk to the post office and retrieve a letter from W, and twice a month, she would sit at her kitchen table and pour her heart onto the page. They wrote of books they had read, of the changing seasons, of the quiet struggles that defined their days. He confessed a deep-seated shame over a business venture that had failed, ruining not just himself, but others. He spoke of his desire to make things right, a desire that felt hopeless and all-consuming. She, in turn, confessed her fear that she had forgotten how to be a person outside of her grief, that her identity had been so entwined with her husband's that she was now just a frayed end. He wrote back, "You are not a frayed end. You are the thread itself, waiting for a new needle." His words were a lantern in the dark room of her solitude. He saw her. The anonymous, faceless W saw her more clearly than anyone had in years. A clatter from outside the cabin jolted her back to the present. A delivery wagon, its wheels struggling in the muddy track leading to the main road, had sunk up to its axle. The driver was shouting at his horse, his frustration a loud, ugly gash in the day's quiet. William stood up without a word. He pulled on a worn jacket and headed for the door. "Stay and finish your coffee," he said over his shoulder. "I'll be back." Elara moved to the window and watched him. He approached the wagon not with impatience, but with a calm assessment of the problem. He spoke quietly to the driver, then went to a small shed behind his cabin and returned with a long, thick plank of wood and a heavy block to use as a fulcrum. He didn't rush. He worked with a steady, methodical strength, using leverage and a deep understanding of mechanics to solve the problem. He positioned the plank, instructed the driver on when to urge the horse forward, and with a great coordinated effort of man, animal, and simple physics, the wheel was freed from the mud's grip. The whole event took less than 10 minutes. The driver, effusive in his thanks, offered him money, but William just shook his head, gave a short nod, and walked back toward the cabin, his boots caked in mud. He had done it because it needed to be done. He had helped without being asked, had expected no reward, and had sought no praise. He was a man whose character was written in his actions, not his words. It was a quality she admired deeply, a quality that John had possessed. The thought was another unwelcome jolt. She was not here to find echoes of her husband in a stranger. She was here for a cup of coffee, that was all. When he came back inside, stamping the mud from his boots on the stoop, she had finished her coffee and was standing, ready to leave. "That was kind of you," she said. He just shrugged, as if it were of no consequence. The man was stuck. He looked at her, and the intensity was back in his eyes, that searching, questioning gaze. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, needing to get away, to get back to her quiet house, where she could make sense of the strange currents running through her. As she walked home, the pie dish, now empty, felt light in her hands. The world felt slightly off-kilter. She had spent an hour with a man who felt more familiar than people she had known her entire life. A man whose quiet nature resonated with her own, whose gaze made her feel seen, and whose reaction to her handwriting was a mystery she couldn't dismiss. Her path took her past the edge of Mrs. Gable's property. The woman was in her garden, pretending to fuss with her late-season chrysanthemums. But Elara knew she had been watching. Mrs. Gable was the town's primary curator of gossip, a woman whose interest in the lives of others was both her occupation and her passion. "Elara, dear," she called out, her voice sweet as honey laced with arsenic. "I saw you visiting our new neighbor. How very charitable of you." "He seemed to enjoy the pie," Elara said, her tone level and uninviting. Mrs. Gable wiped a gloved hand on her apron, her eyes glinting with curiosity. "He's a quiet one, isn't he? Keeps to himself. Some say he has a past. A man doesn't come to a place like Northwood Creek to be left alone unless he's running from something." "Some say a lot of things, Martha," Elara replied, her voice firm but quiet. "I find it's better to judge a man by what he does, not by what others say about him." She thought of William, effortlessly freeing the stuck wagon. Mrs. Gable's smile tightened. She was not used to being so gently rebuffed. "Well, of course, dear. It's just a woman in your position. You must be careful. Men can take advantage of loneliness." The words were meant to be a warning, but they felt like a judgment, a sharp pinprick to the tender skin of her solitude. "I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself," Elara said, her quiet dignity a shield. "Good day, Martha." She walked on, not hurrying, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. But the words followed her home. "A woman in your position." The town saw her as a fragile thing, a lonely widow to be pitied and protected, a potential victim. They did not see the steel in her spine, the wall she had built. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt a crack in that wall, not from Martha Gable's prying, but from the quiet, steady gaze of a man named William Thorne. A man who, for some inexplicable reason, had looked at her handwriting and seen a ghost. A few days later, William appeared at her gate. She was in her garden, turning over the soil for the winter, and the sight of him standing there, his hat in his hands, sent a strange flutter through her chest. It was the same unwelcome, unfamiliar feeling she'd had at his door. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice as low and steady as ever. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, leaning on her spade. "I noticed your fence," he said, gesturing with his hat toward the section along the south pasture. "The posts are leaning. A good winter storm might take it down," she knew. It was one of a dozen chores she hadn't had the strength or the will to tackle. "I know, it's on my list." He paused, his eyes on the weathered wood. "I have some time," he said, "and I'm handy with a post hole digger. I could fix it for you. Set the posts right." She bristled slightly. She wasn't a charity case. "I can pay you for your time." He looked at her then, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "No," he said, "you brought me pie." The simplicity of it disarmed her. It wasn't pity, it wasn't charity, it was a transaction, a quid pro quo of kindness, a pie for a fence. It was a language she understood. It was practical, it was fair. It relieved her of the burden of feeling indebted. "All right," she said, surprised at how easily the word came. "The tools are in the barn." For the next week, he was a quiet presence on her property. He worked with the same focused, methodical competence she had seen with the wagon. He dug new holes, tamping the earth with a heavy iron bar, his movements economical and strong. He replaced the rotten posts, his hammer strokes ringing out in the crisp autumn air, a steady, reassuring rhythm against the backdrop of silence. She would bring him a glass of water in the middle of the day, and they would exchange a few words, never many. They spoke of the weather, of the soil, of the proper depth for a fence post. Small talk, but it felt different with him. It felt like the foundation of something, solid and unadorned. One afternoon, he came to the back door to ask for a drink. She led him into the kitchen, the room that had become her sanctuary and her prison. He filled a dipper from the water bucket, and as he drank, his gaze fell upon the table. Lying there was her journal, the simple, leather-bound book where she drafted her letters to W. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was open to a half-finished page, her handwriting clear in the afternoon light. He didn't read it. He simply looked at the book itself, then at her. "You're a writer," he said, not as a question. "No," she said too quickly. "Not really. I just write things down sometimes." He gestured to the journal with the dipper. "I find it's easier to be honest on a page than it is to a person's face," he said, his voice quiet, reflective. "Words on paper, they don't judge you. They just wait." The air in the room grew thick with dramatic irony, a concept she had only ever read about in books. Here she stood, across from the man who was becoming a tangible, confusing presence in her life, discussing the very nature of the secret correspondence that connected them in a way neither of them understood. She was E. He was the man mending her fence. And somewhere, in a post office box miles away, he was W. The 3 points of the triangle were all in her kitchen, and only she was aware of the impossible geometry. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's it exactly. It's easier to say the truth to a stranger, someone who doesn't know your face or your history. There's a freedom in it." "A freedom," he repeated, tasting the word. He looked at her, his blue eyes holding a deep, searching quality. "But is it real? A connection with someone who doesn't know you?" "It feels real," she confessed, feeling a blush creep up her neck. "Sometimes it feels more real than anything else." He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be turning her words over in his mind, examining them from every angle. It was as if she had handed him a key, and he was staring at it, wondering what lock it might fit. He didn't know that it was the key to a room he was already in. He set the dipper down, the metallic sound loud in the quiet kitchen. "I should get back to that fence," he said, the moment of intimacy broken. He retreated, leaving her with a racing heart and the dizzying sensation of standing on the edge of a precipice. The fence was finished on a Saturday. That evening was the annual town harvest social, held in the grassy field behind the church. Elara hadn't attended in 4 years. The thought of navigating the sea of polite pity and curious stares was exhausting. But this year, something was different. She found herself putting on her good wool dress, the dark blue one she hadn't worn since before John's passing. She told herself it was because she was feeling stronger, that it was time to rejoin the world. But the lie was thin, transparent. She was going because she knew William would be there. He had mentioned it, a casual remark about the town seeming to expect his attendance. The social was a cacophony of familiar sounds, children laughing, the local fiddler sawing away at a lively tune, the low hum of conversation. Elara felt a familiar wave of anxiety as she walked into the throng. She was an island, and the chatter and laughter were the tides rising around her. She exchanged polite nods, endured a few well-meaning but clumsy inquiries about her well-being, and quickly retreated to the periphery, finding a spot near an old oak tree where she could observe without being engulfed. A few minutes later, he was there. He hadn't approached her directly. He had simply gravitated to the same quiet edge of the crowd, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He stood a few feet away, nursing a cup of cider, his shoulders relaxed, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling social currents. They didn't speak for a long time, simply existing beside each other, watching the dancers in the lantern light. The feeling she had was one she hadn't dared to name, but it was pressing against her ribs, insistent. It was comfort, a dangerous, thrilling, terrifying comfort. "You look nice," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. The simple compliment landed with the force of a revelation. No one had told her she looked nice in 4 years. She was the widow, the sturdy neighbor, the quiet woman. She was not a person to be looked at in that way. "Thank you," she managed, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks again. Later in the evening, Pastor Miles called for a moment of quiet reflection and sharing. It was a tradition. People would share a prayer, a piece of scripture, or sometimes a poem or a song. It was usually the same handful of people who stood up to speak. But tonight, as the pastor invited contributions, Elara felt a strange and reckless impulse. It was born of the cider, perhaps, or the music, or the quiet, steady presence of the man standing beside her. It was born of the feeling of being, for the first time in a long time, truly seen. In his last letter, W had written something that had stayed with her for weeks. "I feel like a ship that has lost its anchor, drifting on a sea of my own making. I do not fear the storm, but the unending calm, the lack of any shore." The sentiment had resonated so deeply with her own feelings of aimlessness that she had written a short verse in her journal, a response not meant for him, but for herself. With a heart that hammered against her ribs, she took a step forward. A few heads turned, surprised. Elara Hayes never spoke at these things. Her voice was shaky at first, but it gained strength as she spoke the words into the sudden quiet. "A ship without an anchor is not a ship that's lost. It is a ship that's waiting to calculate the cost, not of the wind and weather, nor of the raging sea, but of the silent harbor where it was told to be. For freedom is its own port, a shore without a name, and a ship that's built for drifting can never be the same." She finished, and a polite, slightly bewildered applause rippled through the crowd. Her face was burning. She didn't know what had possessed her. She risked a glance at William. He had gone completely, utterly still. The cup of cider was frozen halfway to his lips. His face, illuminated by the flickering lantern light, was a mask of pale, stunned recognition. It was 100 times more intense than his reaction to the pie note. The blood seemed to have drained from his face. His blue eyes were wide, fixed on her, and in their depths she saw not just surprise, but a dawning, catastrophic understanding. He was looking at her as if she had just spoken his own secret soul aloud to the entire town. The poem was not just a poem. The words were not just words. They were a direct echo of the private, secret confession he had made in a letter to a faceless stranger named E. This was the moment. This was the turning point. She didn't understand how or why, but she knew with a chilling certainty that in her foolish, impulsive act of sharing a few lines of verse, she had irrevocably changed something between them. The mystery of his reaction to her handwriting had just deepened into a chasm. He knew, she didn't know what he knew, but the look on his face was the look of a man who had just seen the one thing in the world he thought was safely hidden. He was looking at her, Elara Hayes, the quiet widow, and seeing someone else entirely. The shift in him was palpable, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure before a storm. He lowered the cup, his hand unsteady. He didn't look away from her, but the expression in his eyes changed from stunned recognition to something far more complex and troubling. Fear. He was afraid, and in some terrifying, inexplicable way. She knew he was afraid of her. The music started up again, a cheerful fiddle tune that felt jarring and wrong. The moment was broken. People began to move and talk, the social tapestry reweaving itself around them. But for William, the world had clearly come to a halt. He gave her one last, haunted look, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the lantern light without another word. Elara stood frozen by the oak tree, the cheerful sounds of the social fading into a dull roar in her ears. The dangerous comfort she had felt just moments before had curdled into a cold, sharp dread. She had stumbled into a secret she didn't understand, and the knowledge of it was a heavy, frightening weight. From that moment, William's world was thrown into turmoil. He spent the night in his cabin, pacing the worn wooden floor, the lines of her poem echoing in his mind. A ship without an anchor. They were his words, his feelings, twisted and reshaped and handed back to him by the one person he never imagined could possess them. Elara Hayes. The quiet, sturdy woman with the sad, kind eyes who had brought him a pie. She was E, the faceless, soulful correspondent to whom he had confessed his deepest shames, his most guarded regrets. It was impossible. It was a coincidence of cosmic, cruel proportions. He sat at his small table and pulled out the small bundle of her letters, tied with a bit of twine. He had carried them with him for 2 years, reading and rereading them until the paper was soft with handling. He untied the bundle and spread them out. He found her first letter, the one where she described the sound of the wind in the pines. He compared the handwriting to the note that had come with the pie. It was identical. The elegant, forward-slanting loops, the precise way she crossed her T's. There was no doubt. A wave of cold dread washed over him. For 2 years, he had poured his heart out to her. He had told E everything. He had told her about the failed Western Land Development Company, the venture he had started with such high hopes, believing he was helping families acquire good land. He had told her about his partner, Silas Croft, a man of smooth words and hidden avarice. He had confessed his naivete, his blindness to Croft's schemes. He had written, with burning shame, of how Croft had used him as the honest face of a fraudulent enterprise, selling worthless, arid tracts to hopeful families, taking their life savings, and leaving William to take the blame when the whole thing collapsed. And he had told her, in his most recent letter, the one that had inspired her poem, that he had come back. He hadn't named the town in his letters, referring to it only as the place where the failure began. But he had come back to Northwood Creek. He had come back under a different name, his mother's maiden name, Thorne, to see the damage for himself, to live among the people his failure had affected, and to find a way, any way, to expose Croft, who still lived here, a respected and powerful man. His wealth built on the ruins of other people's dreams. He had come here to do penance, to live in a cold room of his own making. And E, his confidant, his anonymous soulmate, was Elara Hayes, a resident of Northwood Creek, a woman living in the very heart of his shame. What would she think of him if she knew? The quiet, helpful man who fixed her fence was the same man whose name, his real name, William Page, was a curse in this valley. She would see him not as a penitent wanderer, but as a fraud, a coward hiding behind a false name. The fragile, precious connection they had built through their letters, and the tentative, real-world friendship that had begun to grow, would be annihilated by the truth. The irony was devastating. The one person in the world he had been completely honest with was the one person he was actively deceiving just by being here. He was terrified of losing her, and he hadn't even truly had her. His crisis was interrupted 2 days later, not by his own volition, but by the arrival of the very man who haunted his thoughts. Elara was in the general store, picking up flour and salt, when Silas Croft approached her. He was a handsome man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed, his silver hair neatly combed. He possessed an easy, confident charm that most of the town found reassuring. Elara had always found it predatory. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "A pleasure to see you." "Mr. Croft," she replied, her tone polite but cool. He smiled, a practiced political gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "I couldn't help but notice you've been receiving some help around your property. From our newcomer, Mr. Thorne." Elara's hand tightened on her shopping basket. "He was kind enough to mend a fence for me." "Kind," Croft repeated, savoring the word. "Yes, he can seem that way." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "I only mention it because I feel a certain responsibility for the good people of this town. A man like Thorne, A man with no history, no connections. One has to wonder what brings him to a quiet place like this. Often, such men are running from something, a past they'd rather keep hidden. It was the same sentiment Martha Gable had expressed, but coming from Croft, it had the weight of a threat. He was not just gossiping, he was planting a seed, marking territory. His past is his own business, Elara said, meeting his gaze directly. I found him to be a decent, hard-working man. Croft's smile thinned. He was not accustomed to being contradicted. Of course, decency can be a convincing mask. I would just hate to see a respectable woman like yourself, a woman alone, taken in by a surface-level charm. Some men are very good at seeming like one thing, when they are, in fact, something else entirely. He gave her a small, paternalistic nod. You just be careful, Elara. This valley has seen its share of charlatans. With that, he tipped his hat and moved on, leaving her with a feeling of cold unease. His warning felt less like a concern for her safety and more like a move in a game she didn't understand, a game in which she and William had somehow become pieces. That evening, William came to her door. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. The easy quiet that had existed between them was gone, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. She led him into the kitchen. He wouldn't sit down. He stood by the window, his back mostly to her, staring out at the darkening fields. "Elara," he began, his voice strained, "there are some things you should know about me, things that aren't simple." Her heart began to beat faster. She thought of Croft's warning. "I came here for a reason," he continued. "I have a past that's connected to this town. It's not a good past. There are people here who have a right to hate me, or at least to hate the man I was." He paused, his shoulders slumping. "Silas Croft is one of them. He has a reason to want me gone." It was a confession, but a partial one. He was giving her the outline of the truth, but not the substance. He was testing the waters, trying to see how she would react. He was being honest, but he was not being complete. He didn't mention the land company, he didn't mention his real name, and he certainly didn't mention the letters. He was trying to protect her and himself from the full, devastating truth. "What reason?" she asked, her voice quiet. He shook his head, still not looking at her. "It's complicated. It involves a business matter from a long time ago. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes that hurt people. I'm trying to understand it, to see if there's anything that can be set right." He finally turned to face her, his eyes full of a desperate, pleading anguish. "I just want you to know that I'm not the man I was, and I don't want you to be caught in the middle of something you have nothing to do with." His words, meant to be a warning, felt like a door closing between them. He was pushing her away, trying to place her in a category of innocent bystander that needed to be protected. He was treating her like the fragile widow the rest of the town saw. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of a horse arriving interrupted them. It was the postboy, making a late delivery. He had a letter for her. She took the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She recognized the strong, clear handwriting immediately. It was from W. She thanked the boy and closed the door, the letter feeling like a hot coal in her hand. William saw the envelope and a look of fresh torment crossed his face. He thought it was a letter from some other man, a complication he hadn't considered. The irony was a knife twisting inside him. "I should go," he said abruptly, his voice thick with a misery she couldn't yet understand. "Please, just be careful of Croft. And of me." He left before she could say another word, retreating back into the night, leaving her alone with the letter that held the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. She sat at her kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm circle of light on the worn wood. With unsteady fingers, she opened the envelope. It was his longest letter yet, the pages filled with his familiar script. But this letter was different. It was a confession. "My dearest E," it began, "I find I can no longer continue this correspondence without telling you the full truth of the shame I carry. To do otherwise feels like a lie, and you have become the one person in my world to whom I cannot lie. Years ago, I was a partner in a venture called the Western Land Development Company. My partner was a man named Silas Croft. I believed we were helping people. I was wrong. He was a predator, and I was his unwitting tool. We operated out of a small valley town called Northwood Creek." The words leaped off the page. Northwood Creek, her town, her home. She read on, her breath catching in her throat as he laid out the entire sordid story. The worthless land, the cheated families, his ruin and his flight, and his return, under a new name, to the scene of his greatest failure. He didn't name his alias, but he didn't have to. The truth, in all its impossible, heartbreaking clarity, was assembling itself in front of her. She lay awake all night, the letter on the nightstand beside her. Her mind was a whirlwind, connecting the dots, replaying every moment since she had first seen him on his porch. The pie, the shock in his eyes when he saw her handwriting, the same handwriting he had been receiving for 2 years. His quiet, careful nature, so at odds with the charlatan Croft had described. His comment in her kitchen, "It's easier to be honest on a page than it is to a person's face." The Harvest Social. Her poem, built from his private words and the look of catastrophic recognition on his face. His partial, agonized confession, just hours ago, warning her about Croft and a business matter from a long time ago. And this letter, this final devastating letter from W, confessing to being in Northwood Creek, the very place she lived. It all fit. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, perfect precision. William Thorne, her quiet neighbor, the man who fixed her fence, the man whose presence felt like a dangerous comfort, was W. The stranger who had been her sanctuary was the man standing in her kitchen. The thought was so immense, so world-altering, that her mind recoiled from it. No, it was a coincidence. It had to be. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the connections too precise. But what if? What if the man she was beginning to feel something for was the same man she had been bearing her soul to for 2 years? The lie wasn't a lie. It was a truth so profound it had disguised itself as an impossibility. The next morning, she saw him walking the perimeter of her property, his head down, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man condemned. He was checking the fence posts he had just set. A mechanical, somber act. She knew he would come to her. He had to. The tension was unbearable. She watched from her window as he finished his circuit, and then, with a deep, resolute breath, turned and walked toward her house. She met him at the door. She didn't invite him in. They stood on the porch, the cool morning air between them. He looked at her, and his face was an open wound of shame and fear. He had come to confess. He was going to tell her he was a fraud, a man with a hidden past. He was going to tell her everything except the one thing that mattered most. He opened his mouth to speak, to begin the halting, partial confession he had rehearsed all night. But he saw the look in her eyes, the exhaustion, the sadness, the unnerving, quiet knowledge. He stopped. The prepared words died on his lips. He searched her face, and what he found there made his own confession redundant. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the morning quiet. There was only one truth left to speak. "I'm W," he said, the words barely a whisper. It was not a confession. It was a surrender. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. A bird called from a nearby pine, a sharp, cheerful sound that was an insult to the moment. Elara did not look surprised. She did not gasp. Her expression did not change. She simply looked at him with an immense, weary sadness. "I know," she said. The 2 words shattered him more completely than any accusation or cry of outrage could have. I know. She had figured it out. She had seen through his deception, his fear, his carefully constructed walls. He had wanted to tell her, to control the narrative of the revelation. But she had taken that from him. She had gotten there first. He flinched as if she had struck him. "How?" "Your last letter arrived yesterday," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You wrote about Northwood Creek." Of course, his final, desperate act of honesty had been his undoing. He felt a wave of dizzying despair. He had lost her. He had lost everything. "Elara, he began, stumbling over the words. "I never meant to deceive you. When I saw your note with the pie, when I saw your handwriting, I didn't know what to do. I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" she asked, and for the first time, a spark of feeling entered her voice. It was not anger. It was a deep, profound hurt. Of you looking at me the way you are looking at me right now. Of you knowing who I was, what I did. The man who wrote those letters," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "was an honest man. He was ashamed, and he was regretful, and he was trying to be better. The man standing in front of me, you let me talk to you about W. You stood in my kitchen and let me tell you how much his letters meant to me. You let me believe he was a safe place. This was the heart of it. The betrayal wasn't the lie of his name. It was the theft of her sanctuary. We was a space free from judgment, a connection without the complications of the physical world. William Thorne, by his silence, had contaminated that space. He had merged the confessional with the kitchen, the sacred text with the flawed, tangible man. I didn't know what to say, he pleaded, his voice raw. Every day I wanted to tell you. Every day I lost my nerve. She shook her head, a single tearless sob catching in her throat. It's not that you didn't tell me, William. It's that you took him away from me. The stranger who understood me is gone, and you're what's left. The words were cruel, and she knew it, but they were the truest things she could say. The grief she felt in that moment was not for a lie, but for the loss of a beautiful, impossible truth. He had no answer to that. There was nothing he could say to defend himself. He had taken her safe harbor and revealed it to be just another port full of peril. I need time, she said, her voice regaining its quiet firmness. I need time to think. It was not a dismissal, not entirely. It was a stay of execution. She was not slamming the door on him, but she was closing it, firmly and quietly, leaving him alone on the porch with the ruins of their two separate, now hopelessly entangled, worlds. For 3 days, Elara did not leave her house. The world outside her windows seemed distant and unreal. Her inner landscape was the only one that mattered, and it was a storm-racked territory. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She sat at her kitchen table with the entire collection of letters, 47 of them from him, 47 copies of her own, spread out before her like a tarot reading of her own foolish heart. She had to know. She had to understand who she had been writing to. Was he the penitent, honest man of the letters, or was he a cunning manipulator, a charlatan like Croft had warned, who had simply stumbled into a deception and played it for all it was worth? Her anger and her hurt wanted him to be the latter. It would be easier. It would be a clean break, a simple betrayal. But her heart, the foolish, stubborn thing, wasn't so sure. She started with his first letter and read them all in chronological order. She was not reading for romance. She was not reading for the echoes of connection that had once sustained her. She was reading like a prosecutor, like a detective, searching for a single flaw in the narrative, a single note of falseness. She read his confessions of shame about the land deal. She read his descriptions of loneliness. She read his philosophical musings on honor and regret. She read his gentle, insightful responses to her own fears and sorrows. She spent 2 full days immersed in the ink and paper, in the mind of the man who called himself W. And as she read, a slow, grudging realization began to dawn. There were no inconsistencies. There was no deception in the words themselves. The man who had written these letters was unfailingly, painfully honest. The shame was real. The regret was profound. The desire to be a better man was the bedrock of every single page. He had not lied to E. He had only, through fear, failed to connect E with Elara. The shape of him, the real shape of his soul that he had laid bare in those letters, was true. He was not a charlatan. He was a coward. And that somehow was both more infuriating and more forgivable. By the 3rd day, her anger had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold ashes of a difficult decision. The personal betrayal still stung, a deep, tender bruise on her heart. But as she stared out the window, her gaze falling on the sturdy new fence posts he had set, a different thought began to take root. Silas Croft. Croft had approached her. He had tried to poison her against William. He had called William a charlatan. Croft was the real predator. William was just the man caught in his trap, a man trying desperately to get out. Her problem, her personal hurt, was a small thing compared to the larger, darker story that was unfolding. She had been a passive observer. Now, she had been given a choice. She could retreat back into her grief and her anger, or she could step into the story. She put on her coat. She walked out of her house and down the road to his cabin. She did not know what she was going to say until she was standing on his porch, knocking on his door. He opened it, and his face was a portrait of misery. He looked as if he hadn't slept or eaten in days. He saw her, and a flicker of desperate hope mixed with terror crossed his features. He clearly expected a final rejection, a verdict. "I'm not here to forgive you yet," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension between them. The hope in his eyes died, but he straightened his shoulders, ready to accept his sentence. "I may never be able to forgive you for taking away my W." She paused, letting the words land. "But I'm not here for that," she continued, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I'm here because I've been thinking about Silas Croft, about what you said, about what he said to me in the general store." William stared at her, his confusion evident. This was not the conversation he had been steeling himself for. "I am no longer an innocent bystander, William," she said, and the shift in their dynamic was seismic. She was no longer the wounded party seeking an apology. She was a strategist. You made me a part of this story, whether you intended to or not. So now, I want you to tell me everything. Not the parts you think I should hear, not the edited version, all of it. The truth. The real, complicated, ugly truth. And then, we are going to decide what to do about it. He looked at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. Then, slowly, understanding dawned. She was not offering forgiveness. She was offering an alliance. It was more than he had dared to hope for, and more terrifying. It meant putting her directly in the line of fire. Elara, you don't have to do this, he said, his voice hoarse. This is my fight. I don't want you involved. You lost the right to make that decision when you decided to keep your secret, she said, her voice sharp. I am involved. The only question is whether I will be involved with you or despite you. Now, are you going to invite me in, or are we going to have this conversation on your porch for all of Martha Gable's spies to see? He stepped back and let her in. For the next 2 hours, he told her everything. He filled in all the gaps the letters had left out. His real name, William Page. The names of the families Croft had cheated. The mechanics of the fraud. How Croft had used William's earnest belief in the project as a cover for his own greed. He told her how Croft had engineered it so that when the company collapsed, all the legal blame fell on William, while Croft himself emerged with a fortune and a clean reputation. And he told her why he had come back, not just for penance, but because he had proof. He went to a loose floorboard beneath his bed and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Inside was a ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of figures. This is the real ledger, he said, not the one the lawyers saw. This shows where all the money really went, directly to accounts owned by Croft. He also had a handful of letters, written by Croft to a third partner, callously detailing the deception. I've had these for years. I ran, Elara. I was a coward. I was ashamed, and I ran. But I kept these. I thought one day I might have the courage to use them. He had brought the evidence of his own damnation back with him. He had laid his entire life, his entire failure, on her kitchen table. She looked at the ledger, at the letters, at the face of the man who had been both her closest confidant and a complete stranger. The anger was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a new, steely resolve. This is not just your fight anymore, she said quietly. Their newfound, fragile alliance was tested less than a week later. William owned a single, sturdy horse, a gelding named Incur, a name he had chosen in a moment of bleak irony. One morning, he went to the small pasture behind his cabin, and the horse was gone. The gate was open, the rope cut cleanly with a knife. There was no sign of a struggle. It was a quiet, deliberate act. News traveled fast in Northwood Creek. By midday, everyone had heard that the newcomer's horse was missing. The whispers started immediately, fanned by people like Martha Gable. See? Trouble follows that man. I heard he was a horse trader back east. Maybe some of his old dealings caught up with him. A man who can't even keep his own horse safe. What kind of man is that? It was a subtle, insidious form of attack. It wasn't an overt threat, but an erosion of his character. A quiet campaign to brand him as unstable, unreliable, and unwelcome. It was Croft's signature, a deniable act of intimidation designed to build a negative reputation and isolate him completely. William knew it was Croft. It was a message. I know you're here. I can touch you whenever I want. Leave. When Elara heard the news, she walked straight to his cabin. She found him staring at the empty pasture, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. It was Croft, he said without looking at her. I know, she replied. She looked from his grim face to the cabin. Where is the ledger? The letters? They're safe, he said. No, they're not, she countered, her voice firm. They are not safe here. He's testing you, William, seeing how you'll react. The next time he comes, he won't be taking a horse. He'll be looking for what he really fears. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. You have to give them to me. He recoiled as if burned. No, absolutely not. Elara, if he even suspects you're involved, if he thinks you have those papers, I will not put you in that danger. I will not have that on my conscience. She took a step closer, her quiet intensity a force of nature. You seem to think this is about your conscience. It is not. You think you are protecting me, but what you are doing is trying to control me. You are still treating me like a fragile thing that needs to be sheltered. I am not that woman. She held out her hand. Those documents are the only real power we have. If they are here, they are vulnerable. He will find a way to search this cabin. But my house, I am John Hayes's widow. I am a quiet, grieving woman who keeps to herself. No one would ever suspect that I am involved in something like this. My invisibility, the very thing I have hated for 4 years, is now our greatest strength. He will not look for them there. He was still shaking his head, his face a mask of anguish. I can't ask you to take that risk. You are not asking, she said, her voice dropping, becoming softer but more resolute than ever. I am choosing. This is my choice. You brought this fight to my town, to my life. You do not get to dictate the terms of my involvement. It is not your risk to give or to withhold. It is mine, and I am choosing to take it. He looked at her, at the absolute, immovable certainty in her eyes. She was not the woman he had tried to protect. She was not the fragile poet from the letters. She was a woman made of iron, forged in grief and solitude, and she would not be denied. He had underestimated her. Everyone had. Defeated, he nodded. He went inside and retrieved the oilskin package. He handed it to her, the weight of it a tangible symbol of his trust, his fear, and their shared, perilous future. She took it without a word, wrapped it in her shawl, and walked back to her house. The quiet, invisible widow carrying the fuse that could either save them or burn everything to the ground. Silas Croft was not a man who tolerated loose ends. William's continued presence in Northwood Creek was a loose end he intended to snip. The stolen horse had been a warning, a gentle tap on the door. When William did not flee, Croft decided it was time to knock the door down. He found his instrument in a man named Jebediah Stone, a farmer from a neighboring county whose land had been foreclosed on by a bank in which Croft held a controlling interest. Stone was a desperate man with a large family and a bitter heart, the perfect clay for Croft to mold. A week after the horse disappeared, Jebediah Stone arrived in town and went straight to the local magistrate, a man whose position was largely dependent on Croft's goodwill. Stone filed a sworn statement, a formal legal accusation. He claimed that years ago, he had been one of the investors in the Western Land Development Company. He swore that William Page, and he used William's real name, a clear sign of Croft's hand, had personally and knowingly sold him a tract of worthless land, pocketing a secret commission in the process. It was a lie, a vicious and calculated one, but it was now a formal record. It transformed the whispers and rumors into a legal threat. The magistrate, duty-bound, issued a summons for William to appear at a public hearing the following week, when the circuit judge, an impartial outsider named Judge Morrison, was due in town. The news hit the town like a thunderclap. William Page, the charlatan land dealer, he was living right here among them, under a false name. The story confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Overnight, William became a pariah. Those who had offered him a tentative welcome now turned their backs. When he walked into the general store, conversations would cease. Mothers would pull their children closer. He was no longer the quiet newcomer. He was a named and accused criminal. He went to Elara's house that night, his face grim. The oilskin package containing the ledger and letters sat on her kitchen table between them, a silent testament to their alliance. It started, he said. He's using my real name. He's fabricated a witness. He's forcing a public hearing. He looked at her, his eyes full of a familiar, protective fear. Elara, you have to leave. You have a cousin in Oak Haven, don't you? You should go and stay with her until this is over. He knows I have no resources, no friends here. He'll expect me to be isolated. But if he sees us together, if anyone testifies that you've been helping me, he will use it against you, she finished for him. He will say I'm a lonely, foolish widow you've manipulated. He will try to ruin my name to discredit you. Yes, he said, relieved that she understood. That's why you have to go. I can't let him do that to you. Elara listened, her expression calm, her hands resting on the table. When he was finished, she looked at him, and her eyes were not the eyes of a woman preparing to flee. They were the eyes of a general studying a map. No, she said, the word quiet but absolute. Elara, please, he begged. This is not a discussion. I am trying to protect you. And I am telling you, she replied, her voice rising with a cold, controlled anger, that you do not get to do that. You do not get to decide when my involvement is acceptable and when it is not. You do not get to welcome my help when it is convenient, and then dismiss me as a liability when things get difficult. Did you think I was offering to hide your papers as a parlor game? Did you think my choice to be a part of this was conditional? You asked me to see you, the real you. Well, I am asking the same of you. See me. I am not a damsel to be sent away from the battle. I am a soldier in it, and I am not deserting my post. He stared at her, speechless. All his life he had been guided by a flawed, often misguided sense of honor. He had run from his failure to protect his name. He had come back to atone for it. Now, he was trying to protect Elara, to atone for the danger he had brought into her life. And she was refusing his penance. She was demanding to be seen not as someone to be protected, but as an equal, a partner. She was, in her quiet, unyielding way, the most formidable person he had ever met. "You'd make a terrifying general," he said, a note of dry, understated awe in his voice. A faint smile touched her lips. "I'm just a widow who is tired of being told what she is and is not capable of." "Now," she said, her tone shifting back to business, "this Judge Morrison, what do we know about him?" "He has a reputation," William said, his mind shifting gears, following her lead. "He's a federal judge, travels the circuit. They say he's stern, but incorruptible. He doesn't have any ties to this county, no loyalty to men like Croft." "Then he is our only hope," Elara declared. "We cannot allow this hearing to be the first time he hears our side of the story. Croft will control the room, the narrative. We need to get to the judge first." A plan began to form in the quiet of her kitchen. They couldn't trust the local post. Croft could easily have it intercepted. They needed a messenger, someone completely trustworthy, someone who could ride to the next county seat, where Judge Morrison was currently holding court, and deliver a package directly into his hands. The package would contain the ledger, Croft's letters, and a cover letter from William, explaining the situation and the false accusation being leveled against him. "I know a man," Elara said after a moment's thought. "Daniel Clark. His father was a good friend of John's. The Clarks lost their farm in that land deal. Daniel is young, but he's steady, and he hates Silas Croft with a passion. He'll do it." The next day, Elara quietly met with Daniel Clark, and by nightfall, the young man was on his way, the oilskin package tucked securely in his saddlebags, with instructions to ride hard and speak to no one but the judge himself. A fragile tendril of hope had been sent out into the world. Now, all they could do was wait. Silas Croft, however, was not a man who waited for events to unfold. He had his own sources. He learned of Daniel Clark's sudden, urgent departure from town. He didn't know the purpose of the journey, but he could guess. Paige was fighting back, and he was using the widow Hayes to do it. It was time to apply a more direct pressure. He did not go himself. He sent a man, a slick lawyer from the city named Fletcher, who had been on his payroll for years. Fletcher did not come to Elara's house with threats of violence. He came with a scalpel of social ruin. He found her in her garden, and his manner was polite, almost sympathetic. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, "I am an associate of Mr. Croft's. He has a deep and abiding respect for your late husband's memory, and for you, and it is out of that respect that he has asked me to speak with you." Elara said nothing, her hands resting on her garden trowel. "He is concerned," Fletcher continued, his voice smooth and oily. "He sees a good woman, a woman of standing, being taken in by a known confidence man. William Page has a history of using other people's good names to his own advantage. Mr. Croft fears that is what is happening here. That Page, seeing a lonely widow with a respectable property, sees an opportunity. That he sees you as convenient." The word was a poisoned dart, aimed with surgical precision at her deepest, most private vulnerability. The fear of being seen as a foolish, lonely woman, an object of pity, or, worse, of use. It was the very thing Martha Gable had hinted at, the very fear William had preyed upon when he tried to send her away. "When this all comes out at the hearing," Fletcher went on, "and it will all come out, the town will talk. They will say that you were compromised, that your grief made you vulnerable to a predator. Mr. Croft would hate to see your reputation, and the good name of your late husband, dragged through the mud. He urges you, for your own sake, to cease all contact with this man. He is a sinking ship, Mrs. Hayes. There is no need for you to go down with him." The threat was clear. "Stand with William, and we will destroy you. We will turn your grief into a weapon against you. We will make you a laughingstock, a cautionary tale. Abandon him, and you can return to your quiet, respectable widowhood." Fletcher smiled, confident he had made his point. He expected her to be frightened, to retreat. He expected tears. He had profoundly misjudged his opponent. The threat did not break her. It solidified her. The raw, personal nature of the attack, the use of her grief, her loneliness, ignited the last vestiges of her fear into a cold, hard rage. They thought she was weak because she was alone. They thought her invisibility was a vulnerability. They were about to learn that the most dangerous person in the world is the one you don't see coming. After Fletcher left, Elara did not run to William. She did not weep. She went inside, washed the garden dirt from her hands, and put on her good blue dress. Then she took the letter. It was not one of Croft's incriminating letters. It was another one that William had shown her, written by a woman named Sarah Miller. Her husband had been one of the first to buy land from the Western Land Development Company, and he had killed himself when he discovered it was worthless, and they were ruined. In the letter, Sarah Miller wrote to a relative, describing her husband's despair and naming Silas Croft as the man who had smiled while he sold us our own grave. With this letter in her pocket, Elara Hayes, the quiet widow, walked to the first of 3 houses, the homes of the Clark, the Warren, and the Davison families. All of them had lost land. All of them were being squeezed by the bank Croft controlled. All of them were terrified of him. She did not give them speeches. She did not try to rally them with calls for justice. She sat in their kitchens, the same way she had sat in William's, and she listened. She listened to their stories of loss, of fear, of quiet desperation. She heard how Croft was threatening them with foreclosure, offering to buy their remaining property for pennies on the dollar. When they were done talking, she would simply say, "I know, he is trying to do the same to me." And then she would show them the letter from Sarah Miller. She would let them read the words of another woman who had suffered as they had. She didn't ask them to fight. She just said, "Judge Morrison is coming. It may be the last chance we ever have for someone to listen. I am going to be at that hearing. I am going to speak. I thought you should know." She was not a general rallying troops. She was a single candle, walking into other dark rooms, offering to share her small, flickering light. She was using her underestimated status, her quiet dignity, as a key to unlock the doors of their fear. She was not asking them to be brave. She was simply showing them her own quiet, terrifying resolve, and letting them decide if they could find their own. The day of the hearing arrived, gray and overcast, the sky pressing down on the town. The church was packed, a tense, expectant silence filling the space between the pews. It was part legal proceeding, part public spectacle. Silas Croft sat in the front pew, looking confident and somber, the very picture of a concerned community leader. William stood alone near the side entrance, his face pale but resolute. Elara sat by herself in the 3rd row, a still, quiet island in a sea of murmuring townspeople. Judge Morrison entered, a tall, grim-faced man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He read the complaint aloud, the sworn testimony of Jebediah Stone against William Page for fraud. He then called Stone to the stand. Stone, coached by Fletcher, told his story, his voice filled with practiced outrage. He recounted how William Page had promised him fertile land and had delivered a dust bowl, showing him falsified survey maps and pocketing a cash commission that never appeared on the books. It was a convincing performance. The mood in the room turned colder, more hostile toward William. Next, Croft's lawyer, Fletcher, called 2 more witnesses. One was a disgruntled former employee of William's from years ago, paid to testify to his shady character. The other was Martha Gable. Fletcher questioned her gently. "Mrs. Gable, you are a longtime resident of Northwood Creek, are you not? You have observed the defendant, who calls himself Thorne, since he arrived." "I have," Martha said, enjoying her moment in the spotlight. "And have you observed him in the company of anyone in particular?" "Yes, Mrs. Elara Hayes, John Hayes's widow." "And would you say his attentions toward this grieving widow have been persistent?" Fletcher asked, his tone dripping with insinuation. "He was always over there," Martha said, her voice righteous, "fixing things, talking to her. A man like that, preying on a lonely woman, it isn't right." It was happening exactly as they had threatened. They were painting William as a predator and her as his foolish victim. Elara felt the stares of the entire town on her, a physical weight of pity and judgment. But she did not flinch. She kept her eyes on Judge Morrison. When Fletcher was done, the judge looked at William. "Mr. Page, you have heard the testimony against you. Do you have a response?" "I do, Your Honor," William said, his voice clear. "But before I speak, I ask that the court hear from Mrs. Elara Hayes." A murmur went through the crowd. Fletcher stood up. "Your Honor, objection. Mrs. Hayes is a victim in this, not a witness. To subject her to questioning would be cruel." It was a clever move, framing his attempt to silence her as an act of compassion. "I will be the judge of that," Morrison said, his gaze settling on Elara. "Mrs. Hayes, do you wish to speak?" "I do, Your Honor," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the church. She stood up and walked not to the witness stand, but to the open space before the chancel, so she could face both the judge and the town. "My name is Elara Hayes," she began, "and I am not a victim." She looked directly at Martha Gable, then at Fletcher. I am also not a lonely, foolish widow. I am a woman who knows the difference between a man of character and a charlatan. Mr. Fletcher is correct about one thing. There is a predator in this valley, but it is not William Page. She turned her gaze to Silas Croft, who sat frozen, his confident smile gone. For years, a man in this town has used his power and wealth to intimidate and ruin his neighbors. He preys on the desperate and the grieving. He threatens them with foreclosure and then buys their land for a fraction of its worth. He counts on his victims being too afraid and too isolated to speak out. "Objection!" Fletcher shouted. "This is slander. It has nothing to do with the complaint against my client's accuser." "On the contrary," Elara said calmly, "it has everything to do with it." She pulled a folded, worn letter from her pocket. "This is a letter from a woman named Sarah Miller. Her husband was a farmer who bought land from the Western Land Development Company. This is what she wrote after her husband took his own life." She read the line aloud, her voice ringing with clarity. "And Silas Croft is the man who smiled while he sold us our own grave." A collective gasp went through the church. Croft's face had gone ashen. "This is the man who now presents himself as a pillar of our community," Elara continued, her voice gaining strength. "The man who sent his lawyer to my home to threaten me with social ruin if I did not abandon my friend. The man who accuses William Page of fraud when he himself is the architect of it." She was not finished. She turned to face the pews where the other families were sitting. She looked directly at Daniel Clark's mother. "Mrs. Clark," she said, her voice softening. "I know your story." She looked at Mr. Warren. "I know yours as well." Then, in the back of the church, a man stood up. It was Daniel Clark's father. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Croft's bank is calling in our loan. He offered to buy our last 10 acres for almost nothing. He said it was our only choice." Then another man stood, Mr. Davison. "He did the same to us." Suddenly, the dam of fear that had held the town in silence for years broke. One by one, the other families Elara had visited stood up, their voices joining in a chorus of accusation, telling their stories of intimidation, of financial pressure, of Croft's predatory dealings. The narrative had shattered. The room was in an uproar. Fletcher and Croft were on their feet, shouting objections, but their voices were lost in the tide of truth that had just been unleashed. Judge Morrison slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking like a rifle shot. "Silence!" he boomed. The church fell quiet, the air thick with tension. The judge's grim face was set like granite. He looked at Croft, a long, cold stare. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice dangerously low, "it seems this hearing about a single count of fraud has become something much larger." He held up a familiar oilskin package. "2 days ago, I received a delivery. It contained a ledger and a series of letters. It told a very interesting story about the Western Land Development Company. A story that seems to align rather precisely with what these good people are saying." He looked out at the stunned faces in the pews. "As it happens, my visit to Northwood Creek is not just a routine circuit stop. I am here at the request of the United States Attorney's Office. This local hearing is now part of a much larger federal inquiry into accusations of mail fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering." He fixed his gaze on Croft again, and his voice was like the tolling of a bell. "An inquiry in which you, Mr. Croft, are the primary subject." The collapse was total and immediate. The color drained from Silas Croft's face. Fletcher fell back into his seat as if his strings had been cut. The foundation of lies and fear upon which Croft had built his empire had been demolished in the space of 10 minutes, not by a legal argument or a powerful man, but by the quiet, unwavering courage of a woman they had all underestimated, and the collective truth she had unlocked. The case against William Page was not just dismissed, it was rendered utterly irrelevant. A footnote in the much larger crime it had inadvertently exposed. In the chaotic aftermath, as the townsfolk streamed out of the church, buzzing with the day's revelations, Elara and William remained behind. They stood in the now empty nave, the afternoon light slanting through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The silence that settled around them was different from any they had known before. It was not the heavy silence of loneliness, nor the tense silence of unspoken truths. It was a clean, quiet peace, the kind that comes only after a great storm has passed, washing the world clean. The weight that both had carried for so long, his shame, her grief, their shared danger, had been lifted. He turned to her, his face etched with a profound, bone-deep gratitude that went beyond words. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. No, she corrected him gently. We saved each other. She had given him the courage to face his past, and he had given her a reason to step back into the world. Their alliance had been forged in fear and secrecy, but it had resulted in a truth that was now undeniable. He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking until only a few inches remained. The air was charged with everything that had been held back, every feeling that had been suppressed in the service of their common goal. Now, with the external threat neutralized, the internal one, the question of them, rose to the surface. Elara, he began, his voice low and raw. All this time I've been afraid. Afraid of Croft, afraid of my past being discovered, afraid of going to prison. But I was wrong. That wasn't my greatest fear. He met her gaze, and his blue eyes were stripped of all pretense, all weariness, leaving only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. My greatest fear, the thing that kept me awake at night, was losing you, losing the chance to know you. After the lies, after the danger, I was so afraid I had already lost you before I ever truly had you. This was his final confession, more honest and more frightening than any that had come before it. He was not just the penitent wanderer or the honest man from the letters. He was a man in love, and he was laying that fragile, unproven truth at her feet. She looked at him, at this complicated, flawed, honorable man who had seen her when no one else was looking. She thought of the promise she had made to herself in the dark, to never again risk her heart. She thought of the loneliness that had been her constant companion. And she thought of the woman who had stood before the entire town and refused to be invisible. That woman was not afraid anymore. You once told me I needed time, he said, his voice barely a whisper. To think, to forgive. She gave a small, slow nod. Yes. Have you had enough time? He asked, the question hanging in the quiet church like a prayer. A soft, genuine smile touched her lips. The first he had ever seen. It transformed her plain face into something beautiful. Yes, William, she said, I've had enough time. And with that, she closed the final distance between them and took his hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers, a solid, grounding warmth. It was not a grand, passionate embrace, but a quiet, profound joining. A promise made not in words, but in the simple, irrefutable fact of their touch. 3 months passed. The autumn gave way to the first snows of winter, blanketing Northwood Creek in a layer of cleansing white. The legal and social fallout from the hearing had been swift and decisive. Silas Croft, facing a federal indictment and the complete ruin of his reputation, had sold off his properties at auction to pay his legal fees and restitution. The Clark, Warren, and Davison families, along with several others, used the settlement money to buy back their original farms. A sense of justice, slow in coming but deeply felt, settled over the valley. The town's perception of William Thorne, or William Page, as he was now known, shifted slowly, grudgingly. He was no longer the mysterious pariah. He was the man who had, with Elara Hayes' help, faced down Silas Croft. Respect, hard-earned and quietly given, began to replace suspicion. Mrs. Gable, in a shocking turn of events, was seen giving him a polite, almost deferential nod at the post office. He had found, in the place of his greatest shame, an unexpected and tentative home. He and Elara had settled into a quiet rhythm. They were not a public couple, not yet. They spent their evenings together, sometimes at her house, sometimes at his, sharing meals, reading by the fire, talking. They were learning the landscape of each other in person, mapping the territories they had only ever explored on paper. They were building a new kind of silence, one filled not with loneliness, but with a deep and abiding contentment. The forgiveness she had granted him was not a single act, but a quiet, ongoing process, woven into the fabric of their shared days. One evening, she came home from the store to find a letter propped on her kitchen table. It was not in an envelope. It was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, her name written on the outside in his strong, familiar hand. Her heart gave a little flutter. It was the first thing he had written to her since the day of the hearing. She unfolded it. My dearest Elara, it began. It seems our story has been written backwards. We shared our deepest secrets before we knew each other's names. We fought a battle together before we ever shared a meal in peace. We became partners before I ever had the courage to ask you to be my friend. I would not trade the path that brought us here, but I regret that it denied us a proper beginning. I have been W, the stranger in the mail. I have been William Thorne, the neighbor who fixed your fence. I have been William Page, the man with a past. Now, if you will have me, I would like to be William. Just William. And I would like to ask you, Elara Hayes, if I may have the honor of courting you properly. I want to choose you out loud, in the light of day. I want to give us the beginning we never had. No reply is necessary. If your answer is yes, simply walk down the road. I will be waiting. She read the letter twice, her eyes misting over. He was honoring their unconventional beginning by offering her a conventional one. He was not assuming her heart, but asking for it, openly and honestly. He was giving her the choice, yet again, to step toward him. She did not hesitate. She put on her shawl, left the letter on the table, and walked out her front door. The snow was falling lightly, dusting her shoulders as she walked the familiar path to his cabin. A light was on inside, casting a warm golden glow on the snow-covered porch. He was standing there, on the porch, as his letter had promised. He was not pacing. He was just waiting, his hands in his pockets, his breath misting in the cold air. He saw her coming, and the relief and joy that washed over his face was a thing of pure, unshielded beauty. She walked up the steps until she was standing before him. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was her answer. "Hello, Elara Hayes," he said softly, his voice full of a quiet, wondering happiness. "Hello, William," she replied, her own voice full of a peace she had once thought was lost to her forever. He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his tired, careful eyes and lit them from within. He held out his hand, not to lead her, but to join her. She took it. He opened the door to his small, warm cabin, and they went inside together, leaving the cold and the past behind them, closing the door on their separate lives and beginning a new chapter, finally, on the same page. Theirs was never a love story that began with a lightning strike of passion or a stolen glance across a crowded room. It was not born of beauty or circumstance or convenience. It was a love story that began with the quiet, terrifying act of telling the truth to a stranger in a letter, the written confession of a soul laid bare. And it was answered by the even more profound and miraculous act of being heard, of being truly seen by someone who was listening in the dark. It was a testament to the simple, extraordinary idea that sometimes the most honest part of a person is not what you see on the surface, but the careful, hopeful words they choose to send out into the world, looking not for a harbor, but for another ship built for drifting on the same quiet sea. Their story, born in the silence between two lonely hearts, became a quiet truth that would echo far beyond the small valley of Northwood Creek, a testament that could travel to any place where someone felt invisible, and whisper that they were not alone.